Hello, my name is Dr. Clay Roan. I teach in the Mathematical Sciences Department at the University of Indianapolis. On March 20th, 2019, I gave a workshop on meaningful peer observation of fellow faculty in the studio as a faculty fellow. The agenda of the workshop included identifying a purpose of the workshop, sharing of experiences with peer observations, tips for observers, tips for those being observed, and a discussion of emerging trends in faculty teaching evaluation. So the purpose of the workshop is, first of all, to help understand the current state of peer observation at UIndy and how it compares with other institutions. I also wanted to share experiences with those attending, to offer advice to observers, those being observed, and to discuss those emerging trends and the role peer evaluation plays in faculty evaluation. To start sharing experiences, I gave some of my experiences with peer observation. I started my teaching career as a high school teacher. In that position, the principal would observe me twice a year. Lakeland Community College, I was an adjunct, and there was no real formal observation protocol for adjuncts. If there was a concern or issue with a particular faculty member raised by a number of students, then the chair might observe, but for me, I was never observed. Eastern Illinois University was pretty involved observation process. The chair would observe faculty members 2 or 3 times each year. He would pick one semester and try to observe you in each different class you taught. In addition to that, there was a 3-member peer evaluation committee that you could have observe you. That was an option to have a peer evaluation committee, and as a committee of 3, and each of those individuals would come and observe you at least once during a calendar year. Part of the evaluation process at Eastern, you could not actually get the highest teaching rating without having a peer evaluation committee. Ball State, there was no chair observation, but each faculty member did have a peer evaluation committee. That committee was composed of 1 member that observed all the faculty members in the department, and in addition to that, there were 2 other members that were selected from a group that did peer observations as a large component of their service. At UIndy, one of the things that surprised me the most is there was no real structure or protocol for peer evaluations, peer observations, or chair observations even. It seems that each department kind of does their own thing, and that leads to some inconsistencies. When asking attendees about their experiences, some of those inconsistencies were revealed. I also had attendees complete a survey through SurveyMonkey, and I'll show you the results. So the first question I asked in the survey was, how often are you observed? So looking at the graph, you can see the most common is 1 time a year, and the other answers were all over the place really, from never being observed all the way up to more than 3 times a year. I also asked who observed you. Now, attendees could answer multiple answers here, but the most common was a non-administrative peer, actually. Chair was the next, and then, of course, there was somebody who had no one observe them. How many different people have observed you in the last few years at UIndy? You can see most people are observed 1 time. Another question I asked is, what do you believe carries the most weight in teaching evaluation at UIndy? As you can see, student evaluations, at least the perception is, student evaluations carry the most weight in teaching evaluation. And in some ways that makes sense. It's the only formal, structured assessment we have of teaching that's consistent across the university. Now, these other options were popular with a few people, but by and large, most attendees thought student evaluations were the primary form of assessment for teaching evaluation. So as you can see from the graphs we just looked at, there is a lot of inconsistency with both perception and what is done at UIndy, giving us the idea as a group that perhaps more structure might be needed or valuable, especially when it comes to P&T decisions, having another piece of evidence that is consistent across the university or at least possibly within departments. So the next thing I did was try to give some tips for people that are observing. One thing to do to kind of set the faculty members at ease is to have a pre-observation conference. Let them know what the process is going to be like. Also, if there's a form you have, to provide that form to them so you know what you're looking for. Some transparency is very valuable for faculty members, especially new faculty members who might be a little bit nervous about that first observation. And during the observation, I believe a good form to help guide you for what to look for, and one that's narrative heavy. This comes from both research and my experiences. I find that the narratives are the feedback given on the narratives is much more valuable than any rating scale or check boxes or rubric that you might be given. An observation form that I've been using as I've been assisting the chair in doing some peer observations of fellow faculty members and adjuncts and associate adjuncts. A form that I've created, adapted from resources that I've used. I'll show you. So here's the form that I use. Point out a few things on the form. I do have a statement giving the purpose of the observation form, and the purpose of peer observation is not necessarily to criticize or judge, but to provide feedback and improve teaching throughout the department. There's also a confidentiality statement within that purpose statement that explains that the form is only going to be shared between 3 people: the observed, the observer, and the chair. So I have some basic information I put about the class: faculty member observed, the observer, class that was observed, date and time of the class, and how many students were present during that class. If it's a class of, let's say, 30, and there's 20 present, I might put 20 out of 30. Then I get into the narrative. And this is where the feedback comes, and it's meaningful to both the chair and also to the faculty member and me to recap what happened during the class. I describe what happened, what did the teacher do, what teaching methods were used. Then I move on to what I believe worked well as a peer, what students seem to respond to well, what engaged them the most. Now, the space that's given in between these questions is not the space that's there necessarily. Sometimes there's much more to write, and this is a Word document, so I can just continue it as long as I want. Another item that I look at is, was there a point during the class session where students seemed to lose attention? What I think might have caused it, how did the faculty member react? And this is just sometimes very meaningful to the faculty member who may not be completely aware of these things. Also point out the physical surroundings. This, for me, it usually ends up being the setup of the classroom. We have a variety of different classroom setups in our department. Some classes are set up in pods of 4 where working together is much more conducive, and some classrooms have rows facing the front with tiny desks where that's group work, and other activities might not be as easy to accomplish. I have a section for suggestions. So this is where I could get critical at points, and sometimes I relate to the faculty member. It's like, I noticed that you didn't do this. I often don't get to that either, and things like that, where it might be a little critical in here. And then I have a section for other comments if there's other things to note. And sometimes I give an indication here how I felt overall, the overall picture, things that, major points that I might reiterate from the other sections. Now, if you were going to use this as an evaluation and not just an observation, you might also include some kind of rating scale. And my suggestion would be to use the same verbiage that you find in our annual evaluation. So, outstanding, exceeds expectations, meets expectations, etc. And this information might be useful to a chair, P&T committee, is how they actually rate the faculty member when it comes time for the annual evaluation. Another piece of advice I have when you're observing is to really be a fly on the wall. Some observers are tempted to interact with the students, the faculty member during the observation. And that could actually change the dynamics of the class itself and give you a false sense of how things normally run in that classroom. Also, fly out the door, and what I mean by that is you want to not linger and have a conversation with that faculty member directly after you've observed them. Oftentimes faculty members are curious right away. They want immediate feedback. They'll ask, how did it go? How did I do? And before you've really had time to process or gather your thoughts to think about these things. And it's very hard right after you've watched someone teach to tell them that things really weren't so good, if that's the case. So I would avoid commenting on anything with teaching after the class. You can simply respond, I'm going to write up the report, I'll get it to you as soon as I can. Now, there is, a lot of people use these interchangeably, observation, evaluation. The observation, again, is not going to include any rating scale. Evaluation will have some kind of either numerical rating scale or, like I said before, the same verbiage that you see in the annual evaluations. I do encourage whatever form you would decide to use to make it very narrative heavy. Even when you use rubrics that are pretty detailed, it's hard for them oftentimes to capture exactly what's happening in the class. Words, to me, are greater than numbers. So whether you're giving an observation or doing an observation or an evaluation, you should have some kind of post-conference. Talk about the lesson itself, talk about the feedback you've given them on your form. And one good question to ask is, what would you do differently if you could teach that same lesson again? This will give you a good indication of whether this faculty member is wanting to improve or they think everything was just great. And sometimes if things are not good and they don't have any idea of what they would do differently, even after reading your feedback, it might be a good indication that maybe they don't belong in their profession. Self-reflection and self-criticism are terribly important in teaching. Now, these post-evaluations, observations, are also very useful in giving them a little pat on the back if you thought they were great or did an awesome job, or they're doing things that you hadn't seen before. And it's a situation where you could ask can I share this technique with somebody else in your department. Now I move on to tips for those being observed. Let's suppose you have an observation coming up and whoever's observing you doesn't have a pre-observation. So you could ask them. So ask about the process. Ask if there's a form that's being used. Can I see the form? Invite an observer to a lesson that you anticipate to be engaging. We, of course, want to show off our best, and if we give the observer the best experiences we're giving our students, it's of course going to make us look just a little bit better than we might if it's something that we know is going to be dry material that we just have to get through. So what do you tell your students? You like to tell students that we're going to have a guest in here, and tell them to act normal. Oftentimes students will change their behavior. Students who are normally very vocal may know the chair's going to be here, or someone else is going to be here, and they'll clam up and not be as participate as much as usual. And then you might have the opposite happen, where you have some students that never participate, or maybe even don't often come to class, and they want to try to catch you off guard and possibly ask you questions that are going to be difficult for you to answer. So I just try to tell students to act like you normally do. It's no different. Be cautious of trying something new when being observed. And suppose you design a new activity you think might be good, but you haven't ran it ever before or anything like it. It might not be the best thing to do when you're being observed. Consider having faculty outside your department come. Someone who's not a master in your subject area might have a better perception of gaps you might have in your explanations and your examples than someone who is a master in your subject area and can fill those gaps in. Do you have a mentor? That's a good person to ask to observe you. Part of their job should be to assess how you're doing at the university and help you with anything you might need help with. And part of that would be observing your teaching. If there's no post-observation that's been scheduled or even talked about as part of the process, you could ask for one. And it doesn't have to be formal necessarily. You say, hey, can we talk about my observation? Now, true peer review of teaching includes several areas, not just the classroom observation. The review of teaching along with assessments, examples of student performance, professional growth, syllabus, other materials. My experiences at Eastern Illinois, we had to put together a portfolio each year in addition to our peer observations and chair observations and student evaluations. And we also had examples of assessments, examples of student work, examples of professional growth, conferences you've attended, teaching conferences, your syllabus, and any other classroom materials that are relevant to your teaching. I have a quality example of what one university does, at University of Minnesota. The peer review of teaching includes much more than just a classroom observation. So we have some rubrics they use for peer review. Peer observation of teaching protocol, peer review of class assignments and assessments, peer review of examples of student performance, peer review of professional growth and development, peer review of syllabus. So we're looking at several areas, not just the classroom observation. That's just one part of it. I encourage you to go to this website. I'm not going to click on each of these links and show you these things, but if you're interested, just search for University of Minnesota peer review of teaching, and you will find some resources that would be useful if you want to get a better picture outside of just the teaching observation. Another tool that's out there is the Danielson Framework. It's a tool used widely in K-12 schools, but could also be applied to college as well. It includes 4 domains to look at with teaching and planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, professional responsibilities. Now, to evaluate these things or observe them even, you have to have evidence. So planning and preparation, we don't really have evidence from a teaching observation, so this would require some document supply by the person being observed. professional responsibilities. Those are things that are included maybe in other areas in our annual evaluation, such as service, classroom environment. That's something we might be able to get a fairly good idea of from a teaching observation. Instruction also from the teaching observation, but one day, one observation is again not going to give you the full picture. I do have a link to the Danielson Framework rubric I can show you. This is an evaluation instrument. If you are a chair or someone involved with evaluating faculty, there's a lot to read here, and I'm not sure it's the best for us, but reading these items would oftentimes give us some ideas of things to look for in the classroom, ways to comment on a feedback form that we have. So I encourage you, if you are involved at all in evaluation of faculty, if you're a chair, if you're an administrator of some sort that's evaluating any faculty, I would read through this. It definitely gives you a good idea of what to look for to determine whether someone is a quality teaching faculty. It can also help you with your own teaching. If you want to find this rubric anywhere on the web, just search for the Danielson Framework. I'll scroll through here and you can see it's kind of wordy, but wouldn't take you very long to read through all these boxes. So the other thing I wanted to mention was some emerging trends in faculty teaching evaluation. Many universities are eliminating or lessening the importance of student evaluations in promotion and tenure decisions in favor of a peer review model. This is an emerging trend, and there are a lot of biases in student evaluations, and a university like UIndy, who has no other formal procedure, is heavily relying on them in determining if the faculty is effectively teaching or not. But this article points out some universities that are actually switching to a peer review model as the major determiner of teaching performance. Across the country, most universities do look at peer evaluation as the major criteria for a major assessment for teaching effectiveness. So I clicked on this article here. It's called Teaching Eval Shakeup. Again, I'm not going to read it to you, but I would highly suggest you read through it to give you some idea of what maybe we should be leaning to. If not at the university level, maybe we could think about what we could do in our departments. As you can see, a couple points I'll make from the article. University of Southern California is doing away with student evaluations and determination of any tenure promotion decisions. They're going to rely only on a peer review process. Now, they will still be giving student evaluations, and sometimes we do get valuable feedback from those. But the research will show you that there are all kinds of biases toward minorities, toward women, and we also have to keep in mind how we compare faculty with those numbers we get on student evaluations. And if you teach all lower level classes, where, like in math for instance, where the students may not be happy to be there from the beginning, you're going to have lower numbers, most likely, than someone teaching grad classes. There is a quote, in fact, at the very end of this article from president of the IDEA Center. So we have been using the IDEA evaluations. The president of IDEA says we shouldn't just be using student evaluations. We want to find a good student evaluation system, but also to use the data carefully, watch for patterns over time, adjust for any proven bias, which I'm not sure we do, and ignore irrelevant data and use multiple sources of data, such as peer evaluations, administrative evaluations, course artifacts, and self-evaluations. All things we just really don't do at UIndy. So if you've been listening this far, congratulations, we're almost done. We're going to talk about some major takeaways that some of the attendees got from this workshop. From a small sample attending the workshop, there is a perception, again, that student evaluations are the primary means of evaluating teaching at UIndy, and probably a perception we need to change by encouraging more things like peer observations, peer evaluations, evaluations of assessments, a lot of ways we can measure teaching effectiveness other than student evaluations. And for those going up for P&T or trying to gather data supporting their teaching effectiveness, we need to seek out those things. We're seeking out peer evaluations. UIndy may benefit from other structured forms of formal teaching evaluation, including peer observation. And in the current state, it is wise for faculty, again, to seek out observers to provide that further evidence of teaching effectiveness. Finally, here are some resources that informed this presentation. Again, we had the Teaching About Shakeup article that I would suggest, again, that you read. The Danielson Framework by Charlotte Danielson, that was an excellent resource to not only think about what to look for if you're an observer, but also ways to improve your own teaching. And again, I used some of my own experiences with teaching observations and evaluation procedures. So thank you for listening, and hope you have a good day.